Today we will be talking about special operations forces and partnered missions and what the relevance of PoC for those missions actually are. My name is Hans Rauw. I work as the program lead for the Protection of Civilians team at PAX. PAX for Peace, a Dutch peace-building organization based out of Utrecht. And I'm happy to facilitate today for you. Let me briefly just go through a few items pertaining to the platform. So this is very much meant as an interactive session, and after our two speakers, we will really go into the Q&A session as well. So please make sure that on the sidebar on the left, you post your questions for the presenters. Please make sure that you can also use chat messages on the left as well. For technical questions, please contact the tech people at our help desk. And further on, please explore the program, speakers' bios, and online library and quick reference guide that is also part of the library on how the system works. Please do engage with speakers and fellow participants alike via the meet and greets. Please make use of our thematic networking islands. And if you do engage with your broader network, please use the hashtags PAX PoC 2020 or @PAXPoC. All sessions will be recorded, as will this one. And I would like to just go to briefly introducing the topic, and let's get really down to the content of the session. So as for those of you who were here this morning as well, we would very much like to broaden the discussion not only for UN mandated missions, but also for all the other things that are ongoing with remote warfare, with proxy warfare, train and equip missions, and what have you. So we are incredibly happy to now move to lessons learned on PoC in bilateral and special operations forces from the UK. And let me just briefly introduce to you Megan and Abigail, who will be presenting. Megan was a research and policy officer at the Oxfam Research Group until recently. Unfortunately, and many of you know this already, but the Oxford Research Group will cease to exist at the end of the year. And that's another reason why we are so happy that we have Megan and Abigail here presenting today, so that knowledge will not stop at the end of the year, obviously. Megan also researches a shift towards remote warfare, advocating for more transparent and accountable approaches. She has examined the challenges of contemporary remote warfare and co-authored hard-hitting reports, including on the challenges of the UK's engagement on the Sahel contemporary conflict. She has written extensively in various forms about this, and we are incredibly happy to have her here present on those issues. Then Abigail Watson, she was a research manager at Oxford Research Group, and while she co-authored 6 major reports, including No Such Thing as a Quick Fix, the Aspiration Capabilities Gap in British Remote Warfare, and Fusion Doctrine in 5 Steps, Lessons Learned for Remote Warfare in Africa, as well as a plethora of other relevant reports and messages on this topic. With the unfortunate end of the Oxford Research Group, I would like to highlight that the remote warfare program will transfer together with Abigail to Saferworld. Apologies for that. To Saferworld. So please do follow her as well, and know that new reports surely will be coming out of Saferworld as well. Now, let me just launch one of our polls so that we can see also who is in the audience at this point, before we move to Megan and Abby to present their insights from the UK on the protection of civilians. Thank you. So first question would be, what do you hope to gain from this session? This is also a good way for our presenters to gain an insight into what you might hope to get from this session, so that they may be able to include that in answering questions and going that little bit deeper on issues while presenting. So I think this is a response you might be able to see on your image here now as well. And there is new ways of thinking and new information are the front runners, I would say. So I think with that, we will keenly listen to Abigail and Megan and see what they will present. Do make sure that you ask your questions on the left in the Q&A section so that we also can pose these to the presenters. And without further ado, let's move on to our presenters of this session. Thank you.
Okay. If you can hear me okay, I'll start. So thank you very much for having us, and for organising what promises to be a really interesting conference. And I'd also like to quickly thank I think there's a bit of an echo. Is that okay? I'd also like to thank Joe and Christian for a really interesting presentation beforehand. I think we already know some of the parallels that will be between the two presentations, and it's something that I hope we can discuss more in the discussion or even later. And I look forward to reading their final report. So in terms of what we'll do today, I'll first give you a quick run through of what we mean by remote warfare. And then Megan and I will lay out two of the key risks posed by its use in contemporary conflict. The first is the shifting of risks from soldiers to civilians. And the second is understanding how remote warfare may exacerbate the structural drivers of harm to civilian. And then we will finish by examining the three levels in which the UK and others can address some of these risks. So our work has focused on remote warfare. At its most basic, this refers to the countering of threats at a distance without the deployment of large numbers of a state's own military forces. Instead, states support local and regional forces to do the bulk of frontline fighting through things like intelligence, air support, training, and special forces. Over the last decade, we've seen this approach in places like West Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East against groups like Daesh, Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram. We have examined the UK's approach to remote warfare through field research in Kenya, Mali, Iraq, Afghanistan, and with interviews of UK personnel rotating out of Nigeria and Somalia, as well as interviews and closed-door roundtables with over 100 experts and practitioners. So in this research, we found that following the drawdown of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a perceived war weariness from the two costly campaigns, and governments that still wanted to engage against potential threats abroad turned to remote warfare, which was perceived as lower cost, requiring fewer forces on the ground, lower risk, because the secrecy surrounding it often meant that there wasn't a need for recourse to Parliament and publics. While the world has changed significantly in the last 10 years, many of these same drivers, such as economic, military, and political constraints to major military deployments, combined with a perceived need to engage against threats abroad. So here you can see in this diagram, you could replace the perceived security threat of safe havens, which was, this diagram was drawn up when we were thinking of the perceived threat of terrorism, but you could just as easily replace that with the perceived threat of near-peer threats. And in this sense, you can see that remote warfare is likely to continue into the future as well. Oh, Megan, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was trying to find, okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. So the real issue here is that the secrecy surrounding remote warfare often means that its risks often fail to be fully understood. So in this presentation, we'll be highlighting 2 main risks, as well as 3 specific recommendations from our work on protecting civilians. So the first risk is that while Western forces may be removed from the front line, local civilians and partner forces instead bear a disproportionate amount of the risks. The second is that remote warfare can do nothing to address the structural drivers of civilian casualties, and may even make them worse in the long term. And so to the first, while providing training, equipment, and air support does mean that British forces are removed from the front line, it is civilians and local partners on the ground who end up taking on more risk. This is exemplified by the Western approach to the counter-Daesh struggle in Iraq, where Iraqi forces were expected to take on a large bulk of the frontline urban fighting. But Iraqi forces at the time had been deeply traumatized by the experiences of 2014, when Daesh had quickly taken control of large parts of the country. And at the same time, these forces lacked the capacity to adequately protect civilians. Importantly, they were, in many cases, reluctant to advance without heavier levels of air support than you'd usually see in urban territory. And the consequences of this can be clearly seen in Western Mosul, a city that has practically become synonymous with the adverse effects of contemporary urban warfare. So we've seen that around 15 neighborhoods, which once housed around 230,000 residents, have been completely destroyed. 3/4 of Mosul's roads, all of its bridges, and most electrical networks have also been damaged, and many buildings were rigged with explosives by retreating Daesh fighters. For Western forces, this reliance on local partners also created problems in regards to casualty tracking, as they relied almost exclusively on air-based monitoring of casualties. Yet what we've seen across Europe, and I think perhaps particularly so in the UK, is a reluctance to have a frank discussion around the difficulty of protecting civilians and tracking casualties in modern warfare. For example, as we've seen that the MOD's line remains that while the UK has killed and injured more than 4,000 Daesh fighters, there's only evidence of a single civilian casualty. This lack of frank discussion on the risks of remote warfare is also echoed strongly in the UK's approach to the special forces. And this is particularly problematic in light of the growing role these forces are playing in the UK's warfare. So in 2019 alone, we saw media reports reveal that the UKSF had been deployed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kenya, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. However, despite this evidence of increased use, there are no mechanisms for the Parliament to hold the UK government to account over their use. And all questions to the government or the MOD are simply met with a no comment answer. As special forces are no longer mainly deployed to only have a tactical impact, but also often to undertake tasks that are strategic of importance, operations that do go wrong where civilians are harmed can severely undermine the UK national security interests. In spite of this importance, there have been few attempts to clearly reassure the public that the PoC mechanisms of UKSF are sound, or that the PoC training for our partner forces are effective. In fact, 2 investigations into transgressions by British troops, respectively Iraq and Afghanistan, were both met with significant political pressure, and eventually both closed down before their planned end dates. So as the UK continues to cast itself as a principled actor and a champion of the rules-based order, it is paramount that it accounts for its own impact on civilians on the ground. This has to include ensuring that the special forces are effective in protecting civilians and training others to do the same. As it stands, it's impossible to tell if it's done effectively.
Relatedly, to truly protect civilians in conflict, the UK and others must address its structural drivers. This is especially important given that, as the conflict mapping organisation ACLED said in its most recent annual report, governments continue to pose the greatest threat to civilians around the world. It is then essential that the UK and others consider the long-term implications of their training to partners. To truly protect civilians in many parts of the world, the appropriate response will not take the form of tactical or militarily focused solutions. Instead, in many parts of the world, governments have used international support to increase the capacity of their security sectors, but have failed to address the structural drivers of civilian harm. In Nigeria, one British soldier we interviewed said that the international effort was treating the symptoms, not the cause of the problem. In Mali, training by the international community is doing nothing to address the fact that the Malayan armed forces and government have been accused of ethnic bias and may accelerate the growth of an unrepresentative force. In Somalia, one soldier told us that the Somali National Army, which receives UK training, are currently seen as just another militia. He said they rape and steal same as the others, but this time with a uniform and a Somali flag on it. More recently, at Saferworld, I am part of the Security Policy Alternatives Network. The Egyptian government has just detained 3 members of staff from the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, which is part of this network. They were arrested as part of a larger crackdown on civil rights groups. One has said that he was subjected to inhumane and degrading treatment. Yet the UK's own security relationship with Egypt has been increasing. For instance, arms sales have increased since 2012. Spike in licenses in 2015, totaling 108 million in standard licenses. In this sense, short-term activities which focus on defence and security institutions, but allow oversight to remain weak and ineffective, can create a situation where rights-violating security forces become better equipped to do what they have always done. This risks further undermining security when populations are trapped between increased violence by abusive state forces and the terror of non-state armed groups. This is not just morally and legally wrong, but undermine the UK's own objectives. Abuses by predatory state forces have alienated civilian populations and pushed more towards extremist groups. In Somalia, the Oxford Research Group was told that the Somali National Army is a huge recruitment tool for Al-Shabaab. And in the Sahel, International Alert found real or perceived abuses by state forces is the #1 factor behind young Fulani people's decision to join violent extremist groups. Similarly, a recent report by CSIS argued that as near-peer competitors seek to discredit, corrupt, and alienate security actors that do not accord with their interests, partner legitimacy, especially among the local population, will be an important source of resilience. More than this, if the UK and others is serious about protecting civilians, they must also look at the actions of their own partners.
So, over 2019, we examined what is required to protect civilians in remote warfare in light of these risks. And we found that to adequately do so, countries must have mitigation mechanisms at 3 different levels: at the national and strategic level, the programmatic level, and with the military. So, to the first one, when it comes to the national strategic level, countries must have a strategy on protecting civilians, which has to first and foremost address how to protect civilians from their own actions and not just those of others. So we see in the UK that the UK 2010 strategy on the protection of civilians and the so-called approach to PoC, which was published earlier this autumn as an update on that strategy, both remain overly focused on how the UK will step in to protect civilians from harm inflicted by others, and not how they'll change their own behavior to better protect civilians when they engage. At the same time, such a strategy also has to be reflective of the challenges of contemporary, often remote warfare. It has to take into account the specific challenges that come from relying on air support and partner forces who may not have the capacity or the will to protect civilians on the ground. At the programmatic level, the UK has the Overseas Security and Justice Assessment Guidance, called OSJA, which is used to estimate the legal risks of all the UK's justice and security programs abroad. However, there are 2 challenges with this. The first is that it's overly legal and focused on the short-term risks, which fails to take into account the reputational and strategic risks of working with local partners. This brings me to the second point, which is that the programmatic guidance also must lay out the specific risks of working with local partners, including how to evaluate if a group exacerbates or alleviates insecurity in the long term as well. And finally, there has to be clear oversight of how well a country's own military is protecting civilians. In the UK, we've seen significant challenges with the government refusing to acknowledge more than 1 civilian casualty in the counter-Daesh struggle, as mentioned before. At the same time, its continued no-comment policy over special forces shuts down all prospects for a debate, and it makes it difficult to evaluate for us whether the effectiveness of their PoC, whether their PoC safeguarding and training are really effective. I think we actually have a poll to hear if everyone else agrees with those evaluations, so please do upload that now if possible. I might move on to the conclusion, and then everyone can vote if it's possible for them while I speak. So remote warfare is often used because it's perceived to be low risk and low cost, but in reality, our research shows that it's neither. So instead, it's civilians who are more at risk, and measurements of success fail to account for the long-term insecurity. It's necessary to have a frank debate about these risks and open discussion on how we can address them to ensure that operations build peace and stability in the places that the UK and others intervene and don't just bring further damage instead. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Megan and Abby, for this wonderful presentation. I think there's plenty to go on to. We would like to open the floor for questions and answers, but before we do that, we are very pleased to announce Mark Goodwin Hudson as a first discussant with a short bit of feedback response to your presentation. Mark has had decades of experience as a military officer, and he somewhat more recently joined the ranks of Civic as a special advisor on the protection of civilians. And he would like to give a very short first response. May I ask you also to kind of, for the questions, responses to be somewhat brief so that we can actually address all questions, or at least most questions, rather than now filling kind of the time with the response to one question. Thank you very much. Mark, can I briefly give you the word, please, the floor?
Hans, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, terrific. Megan and Abby, thank you. That was really interesting. I just want to pick up on a couple of things and then talk about the progression or not of POC within the UK MOD. I think that the first thing I want to pick up on was this lack of frank debate and discussion that Abby and Megan were talking about. And I think that the debate needs to be to what extent the government actually wants to make the protection of civilians a priority, because I don't believe it does. And I think the debate also needs to be addressed around the military advantage of making civilians your vital ground, particularly as the battle space has become increasingly civilian-centric, and you can see that in particular in Mosul. I wanted, Hans asked me to talk about my own experience of working with MOD in relation to POC. My involvement has been in the last 18 months since leaving the army. I've joined a small group of members of civil society. There are about 7 of us who meet with the 2-star, that's a general equivalent civil servant who is responsible for implementing the recommendations of the Chilcot inquiry. And the Chilcot was the 4th inquiry that was looking into some of the failures of the Iraq War. And one of the recommendations of the Chilcot inquiry was that the British government needed to understand and it needed to record civilian harm, both in anticipation prior to operations, but also during operations. And it needed to set up and establish the facility to do that. And having done that for NATO in Afghanistan, I've got a good idea how that would work. The second thing that the Chilcot inquiry highlighted was that the British government has in the past been too focused on, when it comes to civilians, having the information to rebut allegations about civilian harm, rather than actually taking any interest and taking any responsibility into reducing civilian harm. And I think what I want to say in terms of how we as a civil society have got on in supporting the MOD in taking that recommendation forward to account for civilian harm, I would say we've got nowhere, sadly. I've only been doing it for 2.5 years. Other members of the group have been doing it for almost 3 years. And we have repeatedly come up against a stone wall from the Ministry of Defence. And I think that the point was well made by Megan. The MOD thinks that it can say to the public that we actually were responsible for only one civilian death. And I've met the man who actually made that assessment and believes that to be true within the MOD. It's worth pointing out that the US actually did their own investigation into some allegations against the RAF committing civilian harm in Mosul, and found out that we did actually kill more civilians than the British MOD is prepared to admit. I think what I want to say in sort of summary and ask a question really is that the Ministry of Defence by its nature is like a fortress. And I have worked in the Ministry of Defence, and as a fortress, it sees itself not just always primarily involved in defending itself and defending its own actions, and it tends to close rank. And my question really is to do with advocacy, because my observation would be that there's one type of advocacy where we in civil society go to meet with people like the Ministry of Defence, and we're very charming and we're very polite and we're extremely grateful to be there, and we're worried that if we upset them, they might never invite us back again and we've lost that connection. The other approach is to be a bit more combative and to actually challenge some of the integrity of the things that the MOD is saying within the press. And we've seen some of that recently, and I think that's only going to increase at the moment as more evidence comes to the fore about military misconduct. I'm just wondering whether there's a third way where the governments and the ministries of defense that we work with can come to a position where they have a safe space where they can actually share some of their problems and be more honest. And because I think, you know, if we're saying that we are fighting a civilian-centric battle space, if we're saying that by deduction the battle space has changed, then I think that militaries need to be much more aware of and work in concert with the civilian sector if they're going to achieve success in that space. So my question really is, what do people think about advocacy, and how are there examples of advocacy that's worked successfully with countries and their Ministry of Defences?
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks for that response. And maybe we can ask Megan and Abby to reflect first on the notion of, are there just two ways, or would there be a third way to engage militaries on the protection of civilians? And Megan, just a small request, kind of, could you slow down your speech a little bit, because some people have a hard time understanding what you're saying, and we really want to hear from first to last word. So thanks.
I'm happy to start, and first of all, just say thank you very much for, I mean, everything you said, I completely agree with. And I think you made a lot of really interesting points. I think in regards to whether there's a third way, I think what we've tried to do is to have a balance between speaking in the military's own language and saying, if you want to talk about military effectiveness, you also have to talk about PoC, not just for humanitarian reasons or ethical reasons, but also because that's how you achieve your military goals. So trying to, first of all, speak in their terms and in language that they want to speak in, but also pushing and saying it's not good enough to say that you acknowledge. So what the MOD is saying isn't that they have one civilian casualty. They're saying that they have evidence of one. And so I think what the civil society needs to do is to push and say, well, you need to follow up that statement with how are you going to improve your evidence mechanisms and gather more evidence about civilian casualties. And so finding that balance between how to speak their own language and talk about PoC as a thing you need to do to be militarily effective, while also pushing to the things that the military don't want to hear necessarily, is the third way. And it's been incredibly difficult to do. And I don't think we've been overly successful, but I do think it's been effective in some terms, definitely.
Maybe just to add what Megan was saying, which I agree with. I think in terms of advocacy successes, one of the dangers is that it tends to be in the government's own terms, that if that, for instance, in the Modernising Defence Programme review, they said that they wanted more external oversight, which was excellent, and that was a very positive step forward. But then in the last few years, in the last year, reflecting on that announcement and trying to understand whether they wanted meaningful engagement to change policy or whether it was a PR exercise because after Chilcot, all departments have been told that it looks better if they have more external oversight, are two very different things. And I think in terms of advocacy successes, many of the greatest advocacy successes have been in areas that the government was willing to change anyway. And so in terms of moving towards truly positive policy change, I think a lot of that engagement has to happen with those most impacted in the areas where these conflicts are taking place. And thanks again, Mark, for your comments.
And maybe if I can just jump in again, is that okay?
Yeah, if it's brief.
Perfect, thank you. So I think just to say, I think there is a lot of signaling in regards to the government showing that they're willing to have this kind of engagement with civil society, and then that's all it is just signals. So for example, with the approach to PoC, which was published earlier this autumn to update on the 2010 strategy, it said in the approach that they hadn't taken into account COVID because it was finished before COVID became an issue in the UK, which means before March. And so all that engagement we've had since, all that very clear, like all those signals from the government saying that they're listening to civil society about the approach haven't been taken on board because that was after it was finished as a document, which we weren't notified about. And so it just seems like there's a lot of signaling without meaningful implementation in the actual policies.
Thanks very much. Just going by two questions that came up through the audience. One is, do you think it is possible for partnered operations to limit harm to civilians and promote respect for IHL if risks are managed? And the second question would be, in your opinion, what's the most egregious example of UK Special Operations Forces not protecting civilians?
Do you want me to jump in first, Megan, and then you can tell me what I got wrong or missed? So in terms of can partnered operations protect civilians, I think a big part of it is what is your end goal with engaging in that partnership. Too often, the prioritization of counterterrorism or building influence, or even, for instance, signaling to another international ally. One of the things we hear quite a lot about the UK's upcoming deployment to the Sahel is whether it's because of a prioritization of peace and stability in the Sahel, or whether ahead of Brexit it's because it wants to signal to France that it's in partnership with France. And so if the protection of civilians or long-term peace and stability is not the priority aim in your deployment, then you either have to assess whether or not you should deploy at all, or you have to be really frank about what that means in terms of compromising the ability to protect civilians. And so it all comes down to having a frank debate around how that prioritization system is going to work. I might just quickly jump on the Special Forces question and then turn over to you, Megan, if that's okay. Just in terms of highlighting the most egregious violation, I don't know that it's very helpful to speculate about which alleged abuse by UK Special Forces I find most troubling, because actually what I think is most troubling is some of the systematic failures that we've seen, like the shutdown of Operation Northmoor, and the fact that rather than engaging in credible evidence of potential abuses, it was shut down and cut off from what is an essential debate around what went wrong. And I also think that's true in terms of evidence of culture of impunity within the UK SF community. And I don't see this as a problem of a couple of bad eggs. Bad eggs, that's not the expression, bad apples. But I don't see this as a problem of a couple of bad apples. And that narrative is hugely unhelpful. And we see evidence of the MOD trying to either close down debate or scapegoat a couple of individuals instead of acknowledging that this was a systematic failure in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it needs to be dealt with at an institutional level, not by blaming individuals or trying to say that was the worst abuse, so they should be held accountable.
I don't really have much to add because I was going to say very much the same thing, almost word for word. But maybe just to say on the SF, but I think the government has made it very clear that special forces will play a larger role going forward than they already have, which is already a big role. And so it is important to have the right systems. And again, not just look at the bad apples, but actually the system that's failing to take account for these actions. At the same time, I also think it's really important to acknowledge that the way that the UK has like zero oversight and zero ability to discuss SF isn't the norm. So we've done comparisons with allies in Europe and in the US and with Australia as well, where at least there are systems where you can ask questions and there is much more debate than you'll see in the UK. And so it's not the norm. We'll often meet this statement that, you know, as special forces, of course, we're not talking about them. But it is the norm, and among all of our allies, to have more oversight than the UK. And so I think it is something to reform.
Hans, could I say something positive about UK SF?
Sure.
I just think that in the context of the protection of civilians, I was at a defense think tank the other day, and there was a view that UK special forces could be used in a role that the Special Operations Executive was in the Second World War, where you use SF to liaise with civilians for two purposes. One, in order to mobilize any civilian resistance that might be operating, but secondly, also to create mobility corridors whereby civilians can extract, particularly from besieged cities. And I think that this is a role, a very positive role in the context of the protection of civilians and the priority placed on civilians that UK SF should be encouraged to take up. And there's a precedent for it when you look at the Special Operations Executive in the Second World War. But again, it goes back to this question, does British defence put a priority on the welfare, on the future, and on the prosperity and protection of civilians? Because if it did, then it might just actually deploy one of its primary forces, one of its special forces, to meet, to facilitate, and to create the conditions for civilians to prosper. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think it's a good rallying call, to be honest, Mark. Maybe we could just do a last question to Megan and Abby and then start rounding off. As you've presented, deployment of remote warfare is likely to increase. This seems particularly true under the UK's new integrated operating concept. And the question then is, sorry, it just moved as I was reading it out. Apologies for that hiccup. What can the government do to improve PoC and oversight in remote warfare? And also, why is the UK currently failing to address structural drivers of violence and extremism, and how can these better be addressed? So just a small question to round this session off. Megan, Abby, can I give you the floor to provide your input onto this?
Megan, do you want to start with saying how the UK should do it? Because you just wrote an excellent report detailing exactly how they can do it.
It is a massive question, and I do have 5 minutes, but I'll try. So I think it is a matter of breaking it into those 3 levels of national strategy, how to do the programs without harming civilians, and then within the military, which is quite a broad category, but how do you have those PoC mechanisms? And I think, like Mark was saying, I think it's very much about thinking about to what extent the UK will prioritize PoC and then going from there. Because we can talk about this all day long, we can have a fantastic conference, but if there's no willingness to update and to really take into account the contemporary risks of remote warfare, it's not going to improve. And so I think just having PoC at the very core of everything that the UK does and everything that other countries do is the way to really go forward. That's a massive change, but it is required. And then going beyond the legal risks and talking about the long-term risks of working with partners as well is really important.
I completely agree. And I think maybe it's worth just mentioning, so we held a series of roundtables on the UK's upcoming integrated review and what this could mean for the UK's approach. And one of the things that we heard a lot was that partnered operations would play a big role in, as the participants saw it, it would provide a way to build influence with local partners with the threat of Russia and China and their efforts to build influence. And there was a really troubling narrative in all of these roundtables that was the level of the threat posed by near peer competitors means that we can throw values and protection of civilians out the window. And that is wrong on so many levels, and I will just mention two of them. First is that we will always think that we live in an unprecedented time, and you can't say that, oh, this threat is so big, we can't possibly hang on to our values, when those values make us who we are. Like, if we're not clinging onto those values, then what are we fighting for? If we heard in a lot of areas of the world that the UK and others come in an effort to build influence so that Russia and China can't, and then end up reimposing approaches that aren't part of their values. So then what do we support in the areas that we go to? And then the second one is that our values are part of our strength. That was a key part of the CSIS report that I mentioned in my own remarks, that our partners' legitimacy is an important part of their resilience against potential adversaries. And if we end up creating a gap between the state and society that we go into, it's only going to breed more violent conflict, as we've already seen in many parts of the world. And so champion peace and stability is also in our strategic interests.
Thanks very much. Those were fairly concise answers to such a large and somewhat loaded question. So thank you very much, and keeping it brief kind of at the as we are running out of time. I would suggest that this also concludes kind of this meeting. Have no fear, you can, I'm sure, meet Megan, Abby, and Mark during some of the breakouts or next sessions. You can contact them obviously also on the remote warfare program, now at Saferworld. Sorry for blanking on that before. And of course, we hope to continue to engage you on this very important topic that actually makes it a little bit more palatable about what are we talking about POC beyond a UN mandated mission. What does it look like? What challenges are there? And what do we need to overcome to actually, in earnest, work on protection of civilians also in these types of operations? So thank you very much for enlightening us on this. We are very much looking forward to continue to work on this important issue, and also to continue to learn from the UK's perspective for the Dutch context. So thank you very much, Megan, Abby, and thank you very much, Mark, for being the first discussant and also giving a bit of an insider view. Although you might be semi-outside, it was good to have that view as well, so that we can indeed work on a third way that hopefully will be more impactful and longer lasting than the first two. To conclude this, we have an evaluation poll that will now come into view. And let me also highlight that our next session will be continuing at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Those will be the workshops that I mentioned this morning. But first, let's conclude this session on how interesting the content of the session actually was, so that we get a bit of an insight into what people thought. And apologies in advance to presenters. This is kind of one of those really awful moments where you see that and think like, oh, wait a minute.
I've just said it was very interesting, so that must help.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And also, as a last thank you, thank you very much for your active participation for the people who were listening to these presentations, coming up with questions, some seemingly simple and some just very complex. But this is very good to get your insights and your questions as well, so that it's also a little bit more lively, and that we can also apply those lessons beyond the UK, I'm sure. So thank you very much for that as well.